Episode 1. The veil was never white. The night was thick with smoke and bells. The last prayer of the evening clung to the stone walls, but no angels answered. At the center of the cracked chapel, under a crucifix that leaned like a dying man, she knelt, wrapped in crimson, barefoot, breathing slow, like she knew the rhythm of old gods forgotten by even the holiest hands. Her name was Isabel, but tonight she had no name, only a vow, and it was not made with words. The sisters circled her, chanting low. Their veils were black. Their hands were trembling, not from fear, from anticipation, because they knew what she would become, what she had been born to embody. The priest stood at the altar, Father Lucan, young, beautiful in a way that made belief feel dangerous. His cassock was immaculate, but his eyes flickered with something. The catechism never taught him how to contain. He held the Book of Wounds in one hand, a relic banned centuries ago, buried beneath 20 feet of stone, and exhumed when it was finally needed again. He opened it, the page aside, and somewhere deep in the marrow of the chapel, something ancient woke. "Isabel of the 13th Veil," he said, "do you come to offer your body for prophecy?" She lifted her head. No tears, no trembling, only a smile, slow, soft, dangerous. "I come to offer my body," she said, "because prophecy isn't asked for. It's taken." The sisters gasped. One dropped her rosary. But Father Lucan didn't flinch. He stepped down from the altar. The candles around them bent in unseen wind. He reached out and peeled the crimson veil from her shoulders. Beneath it, Isabel wore nothing but a chain of black thorns around her throat. No shame, no hesitation. She was an offering, a weapon, a secret stitched into flesh. The first drop of blood came from the thorn. It slid down her collarbone, hung there, waiting. Father Lucan caught it with his finger, brought it to his lips, tasted it, and for the first time in his life, he doubted that holiness had anything to do with heaven. The ceremony began. The Book of Wounds demanded blood, but it also demanded intention. Each sister placed a hand on Isabel's back, whispered their failures, their doubts, their darkest dreams, and Isabel absorbed them all. The prophecy was simple. One who holds both sin and purity without breaking will open the door and tear down the first lie. By the time dawn stained the sky in bruises, Isabel rose, her knees raw, her lips cracked, but her spine unbent. Father Lucan tried to bless her, tried to speak the rites, but his throat closed, because looking into Isabel's eyes, he realized she wasn't waiting for salvation. She was bringing it to its knees. At the door of the chapel, before stepping into the bleeding light of morning, Isabel turned once, smiled, and whispered a promise the wind would carry for centuries. The veil was never white. You just chose not to see the stains. Episode 2. The blood on the priest's hands wasn't hers. Father Lucan couldn't sleep. Not after the ceremony. Not after Isabel's smile. A smile that looked more like a key than a kindness. He scrubbed his hands in the basin of holy water, over and over, until his skin burned raw. Still, the stain remained. Not visible, not tangible, but real. The blood wasn't Isabel's. It was older, thicker, heavy in the bones. Inherited in his dreams. The chapel walls bled. The crucifix wept black tears. And in the center aisle, Isabel danced barefoot, her steps carving sigils into the stone. Each swirl of her body rewrote something he thought was eternal. Each touch of her gaze turned prayer into hunger. He woke at dawn, gasping, and when he looked down, his hands were streaked with red. Not dripping, not wet, etched, lines running from fingertip to wrist, like veins on fire. He staggered to the old texts, pulling down crumbling volumes written by hands more terrified than holy. One passage caught his eye, half erased by centuries of shame. When the scarlet vessel appears, the shepherd's hand shall reveal the debt he carries, not by her sin, but by his silence. Lucan sank to his knees, because he knew now Isabel wasn't the danger. She was the mirror, and what he saw, what he refused to see until now, was that he had sinned long before he ever touched her. It wasn't lust that stained him. It was complicity. The nights he turned away from confessions too heavy to hear. The mornings he buried his doubts beneath a thicker robe. The days he smiled and gave absolution to men, who paid for forgiveness in gold instead of repentance. The blood on his hands was the price of every word he hadn't spoken, every truth he hadn't defended. And Isabel, she was simply the blade that revealed the wound. That night, he returned to the chapel. It was empty, except for her, kneeling where the altar had cracked, her veil pulled around her like a sunset bleeding out. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She simply whispered, soft and devastating, "You cannot cleanse what you bless by forgetting. You cannot absolve what you built by turning away." He wept, openly, freely, the kind of weeping that sounded less like sorrow and more like a soul tearing loose from its chains. When he opened his eyes again, Isabel was standing. A single thorn pressed her palm, a bead of blood blooming like a reluctant rose. She offered it to him, not demanding, inviting. "If you touch this," she said, "you're no longer a priest. You are mine." He hesitated, not because he feared her, because for the first time, he feared that somewhere deep inside him, he had been waiting for this all along. And as he reached out, the ancient bells of the monastery rang once, twice, and somewhere beyond the walls, a voice, not Isabel's, not his, whispered, one vow broken, one bond sealed. The prophecy breathes. Episode 3, The Thorn Ceremony. The moon was high, a thin blade slicing the sky open, and inside the crumbling monastery, two figures stood beneath a shattered rose window, the glass long gone, but the thorns of its frame still sharp as promises. Isabel held the thorn between her fingers. Blood gathered at its tip, round and trembling, like a prayer trying not to fall. Father Lucan stood before her, chest bare, eyes hollowed by everything he no longer pretended not to know. "Are you ready?" Isabel asked, not tender, not cruel, simply asking, as one might ask if a flame was ready to consume its wick. He nodded, and in that moment, the last veil between sin and sacrament tore without a sound. Isabel pressed the thorn to his chest, right above the heart. Slow, deliberate, she didn't pierce. Not yet. Instead, she drew a symbol, a circle, broken at one point, incomplete. He shivered beneath her touch, not from fear, not from desire, from recognition, because the shape was not random. It was a shape carved into the secret vaults of the monastery, the one hidden behind murals of saints smiling too widely, the mark of the 13th covenant, the vow never meant for heaven's eyes. You were never meant to be clean. Isabel whispered, you were meant to be complete. And with that, she pressed the thorn deeper, just enough to break the skin, just enough for the blood to rise, and trace the broken circle she had drawn. The blood shimmered, not red, not gold, something in between, something ancient. Lucan gasped as the heat flooded him. Memories not his, desires not born in him, regrets that tasted like someone else's prayers. They filled him like wine in a broken chalice, overflowing, staining, consecrating. He reached for her, not as a priest, not as a man, but as something new, something old, something both. Isabel caught his wrist gently, brought it to her own chest, and for the first time he saw, beneath the thin fabric of her crimson shift, the faint outline of the same broken circle, branded, alive, waiting for completion. Do you see now? She murmured against his ear. You were never sent here to save me. You were sent here because I already knew you. She guided his bloodied hand to the mark on her skin, pressed it, the blood smeared, mixed, sealed, and the old stones around them groaned, not in pain, in memory. All around the chapel, hidden inscriptions flared to life, words and languages older than Latin, songs that had no beginning, Oaths whispered before humanity learned shame. Lucan sank to his knees, weeping not from sorrow, but from awakening. And as Isabel knelt before him, pressing her forehead to his, they spoke the first words of the thorn ceremony together, not baptized by water, nor bound by guilt. We bleed because blood remembers what flesh forgets. Outside the winds howled. Inside a new covenant bloomed, and far below the chapel, something ancient smiled in the dark. Its teeth made of broken vows and forgotten prayers. Episode 4, The Breath Beneath the Altar. The blood had barely dried when they heard it. At first, Father Lucan thought it was the wind, sighing through the cracked ribs of the old cathedral. But no, wind did not breathe. Not like this. It was deep, wet, slow, a sound dragged from something that had been asleep too long, something that now was waking. Isabel stiffened beside him. She didn't speak. She listened, and in her listening, Lucan heard it more clearly. Breath, not above, not around, below, beneath the altar where he had served countless masses, where he had whispered words over bread and wine, believing he was sanctifying what was already broken. Isabel stepped forward. The floor beneath her feet creaked, not from age, from resistance, as if the stones themselves were deciding whether to hold or to yield. She knelt at the foot of the altar, placed her ear to the cold, cracked marble, closed her eyes, and smiled. "It's still alive," she whispered. Lucan swallowed hard. "What is?" Her smile deepened. The first word, before Genesis, before commandments, before sin was even invented, there had been a word, spoken not by God, not by man, by something older, something deeper, a longing given shape, a hunger given voice. That word had not vanished. It had been buried, here, beneath this altar, beneath centuries of prayers too weak to drown it. And tonight, the thorn ceremony had cracked the seal. Lucan reached for her, but Isabel stood, her movement slow, deliberate, inevitable. She pressed her palm to the altar. Blood smeared across the marble, and the breathing quickened, not gasping, not desperate, eager. The stone split, hairline fractures racing outward like veins, and from between them, warmth, not hellfire, heartbeat. "It wants to speak," Isabel said. "It wants to finish what it started." Lucan shook his head, stepping back. "No, this is blasphemy. This is heresy." Her laughter was soft, almost kind. "No, Father, this is honesty." The ground trembled. Tiny flecks of dust rose into the air, each one catching the candlelight like falling stars. And then, from beneath the altar, a voice rose, not in words, in invitation. It did not say, "Come." It did not need to, because everything inside Lucan, everything he had buried, prayed against, fasted to silence, leaned toward it. He fell to his knees, not from terror, from recognition, because the breath beneath the altar was not calling Isabel, it was calling him. And as he knelt there, trembling, Isabel leaned down and whispered, "You were never meant to serve the word written in books. You were meant to answer the one still breathing." The altar cracked wider. The chapel groaned. And in the final shudder before the night swallowed them whole, Lucan realized he had already said yes, long before he ever learned how to say no. Episode 5, the first word. It didn't speak in sounds. It spoke in hunger, a pull, a promise, a memory older than flesh. Father Lucan knelt, gasping, the breath beneath the altar wrapped around him, not strangling, cradling, as if it knew him, as if it had been waiting for him. Isabel stood nearby, veiled again in crimson, watching, not intervening. She knew better than to interfere with a summoning older than language. She was not its master. She was its witness. The cracks beneath the altar widened, and from them, the word rose, not on wings, not in smoke, in blood, threads of liquid memory, coiling, seeking, touching Lucan's fingers, his lips, his chest, marking him without permission, because he had given it long ago, when he thought silence could protect him from destiny. He opened his mouth, not to scream, not to pray, to answer, and when he did, the first word entered him. It wasn't a sound. It was a knowing, a violence so pure it felt like grace, a sweetness so raw it bled. He saw, not visions, memories, not his own, the building of the first altar, not to worship, but to bargain, the carving of the first prayer, not to praise, but to seduce, the offering of the first body, not for forgiveness, but for power. The word wasn't an enemy of God. It was a secret no priest dared to whisper. That faith was not born from love. It was born from longing, a longing so fierce. It tore holes in heaven and planted altars on the earth below. Lucan fell back, his body too small to carry so much ache. His mouth burned with verses he didn't recognize, prayers without beginning or end. And through it all, Isabel knelt before him, hands open, palms up, offering no help, only permission. Say it, she whispered. Say what you have always known. Lucan gasped, and from his lips, the first word slipped free. Soft, simple, eternal, mine. The stones beneath them rumbled. The altar split completely, and from the broken earth, a shape began to rise. Not a demon, not an angel, something forgotten, something forbidden, and yet something familiar, because deep inside, Lucan remembered now. He hadn't become a priest to find God. He had become a priest to reclaim what was stolen from him before he even had a name. Isabel smiled, tears in her eyes. Not sadness, pride. Welcome back, she said. We've been waiting for you. Far above, the bells of the ruined monastery began to ring, not calling to prayer, calling to witness. Because tonight, the first word was not a prophecy. It was a birthright, etched into the cracked altar, glowing faintly. 5 answered. 7 rise. Before there was faith, there was want. Episode 6. The flesh that remembers. The word had been spoken, but it wasn't enough. Not yet, because words were just echoes. Flesh was memory. And tonight, the memory had to bleed. Father Lucan stood in the center of the ruined chapel, his chest bare, his skin shivering not from cold, but from anticipation. Isabel circled him slowly, her fingertips grazing the air just above his skin. Not touching. Not yet. The light in the chapel had shifted. It wasn't candlelight anymore. It was something thicker, something that pulsed in time with his heartbeat, coating the stone walls with the taste of forgotten odes. The body remembers. Isabel said softly, each word a thread pulling tighter around him. Before the mind forms excuses, before the soul pleads innocence, the flesh knows. She stopped behind him, her breath ghosted over his spine. He could feel every scar he had ever earned, every shiver he had ever denied, every hunger he had ever swallowed. And under her touch, they woke. She pressed a single finger to the small of his back, not forcefully, tenderly, as if apologizing for what she was about to unleash. And then, without warning, her nail carved a line down his back. Not deep, not cruel, just enough for the blood to remember what it was made for. Lucan gasped, not in pain, in recognition, because as the blood welled, so did the visions. He saw a garden with no gates, a sky without judgment, a touch that was neither permitted nor forbidden. It simply was. Freedom before sin, desire before shame, a world before no. Isabel stepped around him, faced him. Her crimson shift clung to her like second skin, her eyes alight with something fierce and ancient. She dipped her fingers into his blood, marked a line across his chest, over his heart, then her own, connecting them. The body does not need to ask. She whispered, it only needs to remember. Lucan reached for her, not as priest, not as penitent, but as something older than either, something pure in its defiance. Their hands met, and the moment they touched, the world inside the chapel shuddered. The cracked stones glowed. The broken crucifix wept salt. The air twisted into shapes that spoke without sound. The ceremony had begun, not written in any book, not sanctioned by any heaven, but true in a way no dogma could deny. They moved together, not hurried, sacred. Every breath, every graze of skin, every shared gasp was a prayer carved into the soft clay of memory. And as their bodies found a rhythm older than worship, older than sin, the chapel walls began to whisper back, "You were never broken. You were unfinished. You were never banished. You were bound. You were never punished. You were promised." When it ended, they did not fall apart. They knelt, forehead to forehead, breathing each other's name without speaking. And on the altar behind them, new words etched themselves in blood and light. 6 awakened, 6 remain. The flesh does not betray. It remembers. Outside, the first rain in decades fell, but it did not wash the memory away. It baptized it. Episode 7, The Saint That Never Wanted Wings. The rain had not stopped. It slid down the broken stones, pattered against stained glass already shattered, and whispered to the marrow of the monastery like 1,000 tiny apologies. Father Lucan and Isabel stood in the nave, their skin still sang with memory, their bodies still humming with truths too old for scripture. And yet, the air around them was restless. Something unseen had shifted, something waiting to be found. They moved as one, barefoot over the cold stones, until they reached the far corner of the ruined chapel, a place even the faithful had forgotten. There, hidden behind collapsed pews and dust-thick drapery, stood a statue, weathered, cracked, but unmistakably holy. Or at least it once was. The figure was tall, robed, head bowed, no name inscribed at its base. No halo, no label, only 2 empty spaces carved crudely at its back, where wings should have been. Blood wept from those wounds. Slow, steady, dark, but not black. Living. Isabel reached out first. Her fingertips brushed the marble skin. Warm, too warm, alive with sorrow. Lucan followed, his hand joining hers. Together, they traced the rough scars where wings had been torn away. And in that shared touch, the memory flooded them both. A figure once beloved, not cast down for pride, not punished for rebellion, but one who had knelt before the throne and whispered, "I do not wish to ascend. I wish to stay." The others called it betrayal, cowardice, sin, but it had not been weakness. It had been love, a love too tangled with earth, too loyal to soil and skin and imperfection, a love heaven could not permit. So they stripped him, severed his wings, buried his name, and built churches over the places where he once walked, praying never to hear his heartbeat again. But heartbeat never needed permission. It only needed a crack to slip through. The rain thickened, not outside, inside. Droplets pooled at the statue's feet, turning dust to mud, memory to marrow, and from somewhere deep beneath the stones, a voice rose, not with anger, not with blame, with sorrow. "You crown me a saint, because you were too afraid to crown yourselves human." Isabel knelt. Lucan did too, not in worship, in mourning, because they understood now. The Scarlet Vow was not about desecration. It was about restoration, about bringing back the ones who chose love over obedience, blood over crown. The statue cracked, not crumbling, shedding, and beneath the broken marble, for a breathless second, they saw flesh, pale, breathing, waiting. Then the vision faded. The rain ceased, but across the base of the statue, in letters too raw to be carved by hand, appeared. 7 bled, 5 remain. Not all angels fell. Some chose to stay. Outside, the first thunder of true awakening rolled across the sky, and somewhere between earth and heaven, something began to stir, something that would not be denied again. Episode 8, The Crown That Cut Deeper Than Thorns. It called to her in dreams first, a whisper beneath her ribs, a weight between her breaths, a name she did not remember ever speaking, but missed all the same. After the night of the weeping statue, Isabel could no longer sleep. The rain had stopped, but something wetter, heavier, hung in the marrow of the monastery walls. A pulse, a summons. She followed it, barefoot, bare-shouldered, her crimson veil trailing like spilled ink across the stones. Father Lucan followed too, silent as guilt, silent as prayer. Down they went, spiraling through passages no blueprint dared record. Each step downward felt less like descent and more like remembering. At the bottom, a door, wood rotted to bone, iron hinges clinging to their last breath. No lock, no handle, only an impression at its center, the shape of a crown. Isabel placed her hand over it, not with fear, with inevitability. The door sighed open, like an old lung taking its final gasp. Inside, a chamber of dirt and bone, and at its heart, half buried in the wet earth, the crown. It was not golden. It did not gleam. It was forged from thorns and iron, twisted together by hands that must have known both mercy and malice. Each thorn was a story, a betrayal, a bloodline cursed by the love it refused to renounce. Isabel knelt before it. Father Lucan stood behind her, but he did not speak. This was not his decision to make. It never had been. She reached out. The metal was cold, but beneath that cold, something throbbed. A living memory, a dormant kingdom, a grief so old it had fossilized in the hunger. She lifted the crown. It resisted, not because it was heavy, but because it knew what would happen once it left the ground. The thorns bit into her palms. Blood welled instantly, trickling between her fingers, staining the iron brighter than any coronation robe. But she did not flinch. She placed the crown upon her head. The air ruptured, the chamber shook, and from the very stones themselves, a cry rose, not of agony, not of rebellion, of recognition. Visions tore through her. A queen kneeling before a tribunal of men who dared call themselves saints. A city burning because its women refused to kneel again. A bloodline severed by decree, but never truly broken. Isabel screamed, but it wasn't pain. It was memory, flooding back, drowning her, cleansing her. When the vision subsided, she stood, not unsteady, not unsure, but crowned in every way that mattered. Father Lucan fell to one knee, not from duty, from awe, because before him no longer stood a girl trained to submit. Before him stood the heir of a forgotten rebellion, a queen who never needed wings to ascend, only her own blood, and a crown that cut deeper than any thorn, etched into the dirt beneath their feet, lit by an unseen hand. 8 remembered, for remain, the blood was never lost. It was waiting for the head brave enough to wear it. Above, the monastery bells tolled once, twice, 13 times, calling not to worship, calling to war. Episode 9, the garden that grows only from betrayal. The bells had stopped, but the sound still throbbed in their blood, carrying them forward, through corridors that twisted like veins around a dying heart. Isabel walked ahead, her crimson veil dragging ash and dust into a trail behind her. The crown dug into her scalp. The thorns sang to her now, a song made not of melodies, but of promises broken before they were ever spoken. Father Lucan followed, silent, torn between loyalty and the terrible beauty he now served. They reached the door, iron, sealed with no lock, no handle, only a simple engraving at its center, a heart, split down the middle by a dagger. No words, no blessing, only truth. Isabel pressed her bloody palm against it. The door shuddered, groaned, and slowly swung open. What lay beyond was not a garden, not in the way the world knew gardens. No sunlight, no dew, only darkness. And in that darkness, growth, vines curled along the blackened stone, leaves of silver and ash shivered without wind. Flowers bloomed wide, their petals soft as secrets, their fragrance heady with grief. Every root, every bloom, every thorn fed on one thing alone: betrayal. Isabel stepped into it. The plants recoiled at first, then leaned toward her, sensing the fresh betrayal humming through her blood. Not of Lucan, not yet, but of the church, the world, the lie that obedience was ever meant to save her. Father Lucan hesitated at the threshold. The air inside the garden was heavier, hungrier. It tasted like regret, and smelled like choices that could never be undone. Isabel turned to him, her voice low, dangerous, tender. "You cannot enter unless you give it something, Lucan. It does not grow from love. It only grows from what love leaves behind." He understood immediately. The garden demanded a betrayal, not a betrayal of duty, not of vows, something deeper, something personal. Lucan clenched his fists. He thought of the boy he once was, the faith he once held like a sword, the prayers he whispered not to save himself, but to save a mother who never wanted saving, a mother who had chosen her own ruin over him, and he had loved her still. Until now. Lucan stepped forward. He whispered her name. Once, let it die in the air, and as he did, the vine shivered, the flowers quivered, and a path unfurled before him, woven from silver roots and thorn branches. The garden accepted his offering, accepted his first true betrayal. As they moved deeper, the plants changed. They grew taller, darker. The blooms now bled sap the color of old bruises. And in the heart of the garden, they found it, a tree, twisted, monstrous, bearing fruit shaped like hearts, each one pulsing, each one engraved with names. Isabel reached for one. It pulsed under her hand, beating faster as she touched it. On its skin, her own name, carved there long before she was ever born. She plucked it free, and the tree shuddered, relieved. "What is it?" Lucan whispered. Isabel smiled, a smile full of sadness and triumph. "It's what they tried to bury. It's the proof that even before they called us sinners, they needed our blood to grow their faith." Above them, a voice bloomed like smoke through the roots. 9 awaken, 3 remain. Betrayal is not the fall, it is the seed. And as Isabel bit into the fruit, blood running down her chin like wine at an unholy feast, Lucan realized he had not followed her into darkness. He had followed her home. Episode 10, The Blood Wedding. There was no choir, no flowers, no congregation, only stone and blood and silence thick enough to drown in. At the heart of the garden, beneath the twisting branches of the tree of betrayals, a circle had been drawn, not with chalk, not with salt, with veins, long black cords of living root, pulsing softly, encircling the space where destiny would be carved. Isabel stood in the center, barefoot, bare-shouldered, wearing only the crown of thorns and a white shift now stained pink from her own blood. She looked like a bride, but not one promised to salvation, one promised to memory, to truth, to the wound that made her who she was. Father Lucan stood at the edge of the circle, watching, waiting, his breath shallow, because he knew he could not save her from this. He could only witness. Isabel held the heart-shaped fruit she had taken from the tree. It beat faintly in her hands, as if it knew what was about to happen, as if it remembered. The ritual was simple, cruel, pure. She would wed not a man, not a god, but herself, her wound, her betrayal, her blood, because no power is ever truly yours until you marry your own ruin. She raised the fruit to her lips, bit down. It was not like eating. It was like being eaten. The heart burst in her mouth, warm and thick, flooding her senses with tastes she could not name. Sorrow, pride, loneliness, glory, each chew a prayer she had never dared pray out loud. Her knees buckled, but she did not fall. The roots beneath her feet held her steady, cradling her like a mother who finally admitted her love too late. The blood from the fruit dripped down her chin, onto her chest, into the soil. The ground shivered, the tree groaned, and from the blood-soaked earth, a veil rose, black as regret, heavy as oath. She lifted it with trembling hands. placed it over her head, and the moment the veil settled over her crowned hair, the earth accepted her. The garden bloomed all at once, not with flowers, with memories. Visions flared around her. 1,000 women kneeling not in prayer, but in refusal. 1,000 vows made not to gods, but to their own broken, beautiful selves. 1,000 blood weddings lost to time, now remembered through her. Father Lucan wept, not in fear, in reverence, because Isabel was no longer merely a vessel. She was a kingdom. She opened her mouth, and the first word spoke again, not through her, but as her. I am the bride of my own wound. I am the covenant of my own undoing. I am the sacrament they could never break. The sky above the monastery cracked, lightning without thunder, light without judgment, and etched into the stone at her feet, a vow written in blood and flame. 10 crowned, 2 remain. The wedding was never to the Savior. It was always to the scar. As Isabel lowered her arms, veiled and crowned, Father Lucan stepped into the circle, not as priest, not as redeemer, but as the first witness. To the oldest truth, the most sacred marriages are not to the divine, but to the pieces of ourselves we were taught to abandon. And from the blackened branches above, the tree of betrayals wept, but not in sorrow, in blessing. Episode 11, the bells that toll for no one. The veil was still heavy on Isabel's head when the first bell tolled. Low, hollow, a sound that didn't shake the air. It shook the marrow. Father Lucan froze. There were no bells left in the monastery, not since the collapse, not since the silence. And yet, the sound rang out clear, impossibly close. Isabel lifted her face to the broken ceiling, her crowned head gleaming wet under the ruined sky. She didn't flinch. She smiled. The second bell followed, not louder, deeper, as if each toll was not calling out, but pulling something inward. From the edges of the garden, figures began to emerge, not living, not fully dead, ghosts made of regret and unfinished prayers. The ones who had built the walls that caged her, the ones who had bent their knees before the lie, because it was easier than bleeding for the truth. Priests, mothers, lovers, scribes, their faces blurred, their mouths sewn shut by their own cowardice. The third bell tolled, and with it, the garden pulsed. The silver vines tightened. The ash flowers bloomed black. The air thickened with the perfume of betrayal long since rotted into prophecy. Isabel stepped forward. The crown of thorns gleamed as the rain returned. Light this time, as if the heavens themselves were weeping in resignation. The ghosts knelt before her, one by one, ash falling from their hollow mouths. In place of apologies they no longer had the right to offer. "You hear it," Isabel said, her voice rich and terrible. "The bells toll for no one, because there is no forgiveness here." Father Lucan watched, his heart breaking open like a cracked chalice, because he understood these souls were not being summoned to judgment. They were being summoned to witness, to see what they had tried to silence, to see the vow fulfilled in blood and memory, to see Isabel not broken, not cleansed, but crowned by the very wounds they gave her. The fourth bell tolled, longer, lower, and the earth beneath their feet shifted, not crumbling, breathing. The garden leaned closer. The trees bent their heads. Everything in that forgotten place bowed before her, not to worship, to admit. Isabel spoke again, soft, final. "You did not kill me. You planted me, and now I bloom in soil you thought was poisoned." The fifth bell never came, because the bells were never meant to call death. They were meant to call rebirth. As the echoes faded, the ghost dissolved into the soil, feeding it, strengthening it, becoming part of the garden they had tried so desperately to bury. And written in glistening vines across the altar stone, 11 awakened, 1 remains. The bells toll for those who buried their sins, only to find them bloom. Father Lucan fell to his knees, not in penance, not in defeat, in awe, because he knew the 12th awakening was not coming from above. It was coming from within, and when it rose, Nothing, not the church, not heaven, not even time itself, would be able to silence it again. Episode 12, The 12th Wound. The earth had swallowed the last of the ghosts. The bells had gone silent. The garden had bowed. And yet, Isabel remained standing, veiled, crowned, but unfinished. Incomplete. Father Lucan rose from where he knelt, his body aching with awe and terror. He knew what had to happen. He knew it wasn't over. The prophecy was never about survival. It was never about revenge. It was about becoming. And nothing truly becomes until it is broken open from within. Isabel turned to him, her eyes no longer merely human, no longer needing absolution, only acknowledgement. She spoke, and the garden leaned closer to hear. 11 wounds given, none were mine. Now the 12th must be taken. She extended a blade, simple, crude, worn smooth by 1,000 forgotten hands. An instrument not of death, but of truth. Lucan took it, his fingers closing around the hilt, like a prayer he didn't know he still remembered. Where? He whispered, voice raw. Isabel smiled, sad, holy. She touched her own chest, just above her heart. Here, the wound they never dared to give me, the one I choose for myself. Lucan hesitated, not from fear of hurting her, from fear of what it would awaken, because once the 12th wound opened, there would be no going back, no silence to retreat into, no chains of doctrine strong enough to bind her, or him. You must, she said, voice steady. Otherwise, all we have done will become just another myth for men to twist. Cut me open and let the true word finally breathe. Lucan raised the blade. The garden held its breath. The thorns on the crown tightened. The soil pulsed. The air itself turned thick enough to drown in. He pressed the blade against her skin, just lightly, enough to feel her heart beat through the metal. Strong, certain, endless. And then he pushed. The blade sank in, not deep, not fatal, but deep enough to birth. Isabel exhaled, long, slow, and as her blood welled, thick, luminous, singing, the garden erupted. Vines exploded upward. Ash flowers shed their blackness and bloomed in blinding white. The tree of betrayals split open, revealing a hollow core filled with light, pulsing with every beat of Isabel's heart. Her blood flowed freely, but it did not spill uselessly. It traced patterns into the earth. It etched names into the stones. It rewrote the prophecy into flesh and bone, and above her head, etched into the very sky, were the final words, 12 completed, none undone. The wound was not the curse. It was a crown. Isabel smiled through the pain, because she understood now. The 12th wound was never meant to end her. It was meant to begin her. Lucan dropped the blade, fell to his knees, because before him stood not a girl, not a martyr, not a queen, but a Genesis. The Scarlet Vow was fulfilled, but Isabel was just beginning. And in the silence that followed, a new sound was born. Not a cry, not a scream, not a hymn, a word, spoken for the first time, in a voice that belonged not to gods, nor men, but to the blood itself. Episode 13, The Word Made Flesh. The garden was silent, not dead, listening. The earth, the vines, the shattered altar, even the cracked heavens above. They all leaned in, waiting, because something ancient had been undone, and something older still was about to be born. Isabel stood at the center of the sacred ruin, her blood-soaked veil clinging to her skin, her crown of thorns now blooming with small red flowers, flowers that pulsed like tiny, independent hearts. The 12th wound still bled, not weakly, not wastefully. Every drop fell with purpose. Every drop wrote a line of a gospel no priest had ever dared imagine. Father Lucan knelt before her, his robes torn, his spirit stripped to the bone. He did not weep. He did not pray. He simply watched. Because this was not a moment for men to claim. It was a moment to witness. Isabel lifted her hands. The blood dripping from her fingertips glowed, golden in some angles, black in others. Truth has always had two faces. She spoke, and it was not a human voice, not a divine one. It was a first word, now full, now clothed in bone and breath. I am the prayer that was never allowed to end. I am the hunger you tried to shame into obedience. I am the vow you whispered to yourself, in the dark places, when you thought no one was listening. Her words cracked the air. The old stone split further, but not with destruction, with release. From the cracks, new roots spilled out, twisting upward, flowering instantly, bearing fruits that glowed with forbidden memory. The altar crumbled into dust. The garden bloomed into a cathedral of flesh and ash, and the broken ceiling overhead pulled apart like wounded skin, revealing a sky no longer held hostage by dogma. Lucan bowed his head, pressing his forehead into the earth, because he understood now. The Scarlet Vow was never about desecrating the holy. It was about reminding the holy what it had forgotten to love: the flesh, the ache, the unrepentant beauty of being unfinished. Isabel turned slowly. Every step she took rewrote the ground. Each footfall sprouted new life. Not pure, not perfect, real, forged of mistakes and blood and stubborn hope. At the threshold of the garden, she paused. The crown of thorns shimmered. The veil lifted itself from her shoulders and dissolved into mist. She was unveiled now, crowned now, not as a queen, not as a saint, as the Word made flesh. She looked back once, met Lucan's gaze. No command, no plea, only an invitation. Will you follow a word that bleeds? And without speaking, Lucan rose, stepped into her shadow, and together they left the old world behind, etched into the stones where she once stood, glowing with the light of 1,000 untold prayers. 12 crowned, one ascended. The word was never lost. It was waiting for a body brave enough to carry it. Far above them, the old heavens trembled, and somewhere in the deep places beneath the earth, the forgotten gods, the ones who never needed worship, only remembrance, smiled. The world did not end that night. It began, again, but this time, it did not begin with light. It began with blood, and a girl who wore her scars. Like a gospel no empire would ever silence again.